To explain what Jarilo-VI was like before the Eternal Freeze, we must know where the name Jarilo came from. The name Jarilo originated from an ancient god of springtime and war thousands of years ago. Now you may be thinking, he could be another powerful being like the Aeons. Unfortunately, the god Jarilo probably never existed. Instead, he would be akin to a mythical god from an ancient civilization like the Greek or Egyptian mythologies. But don't let that discredit his importance. Like all myths and their civilizations, Jarilos gives us a unique insight into the planet's culture and climate before the Eternal Freeze. Perun was the god of thunder and lightning, striking down sinners, evil spirits, and demons with fiery arrows from his chariot. Veles, god of land, water, forests, and the underworld, is sworn enemies with Perun. Perun often pursues Veles across the world, destroying the various forms and disguises Veles takes. On the last night of February, Perun's 10th son, Jarilo, was born. That very night, the mischievous Veles kidnapped Jarilo and brought him to his domain, the land of the dead, to raise him. This land was a lush prairie of eternal spring across the sea. Jarilo spent his childhood there herding cattle. Eventually, though, Jarilo began to dislike his life being trapped underground, and thus, at the end of winter, Jarilo returned to Earth and used his powers as god of springtime and war to drive away the cold and darkness, this marking the end of winter and ushering in spring. The first god to notice and welcome Jarilo was the goddess of death, Morana, Perun's daughter and Jarilo's sister. The two fell in love and were wed in the summer. This unification symbolized the promise of fertility and lush vegetation, as well as peace between Perun and Veles, and that the late summer harvest would be successful and bountiful. However, Jarilo was not a faithful husband. Morana, enraged by Jarilo's infidelity, murders him, and uses his corpse to build a new home. Eventually, Morana without Jarilo becomes a bitter old witch, bringing about a cold winter. By the year's end, Morana eventually dies. But that's not where this story ends. Morana is reincarnated as the goddess Vesna. At the same time, Jarilo is also reborn, and the myth begins again. Before continuing, I think it's best to analyze the story thus far. The first thing I want to mention is that this myth is almost identical to the Slavic myth of Jarilo, god of springtime, who happens to have the same name. In fact, all of Belobog, from technology to architecture, is reminiscent to 19th century and early 20th century Russia. From the myth, we can also gather that Jarilo-VI has seasons. Jarilo descending to Earth marks the start of spring. The unification of Morana and Jarilo happens during the summer. Morana killing Jarilo most likely occurs or causes fall. And finally, winter eventually occurs because of Morana's anger. The summer harvest, coming from the union of two gods, depicts the sanctity and importance farming has on Jarilo's ancient civilization. Lastly, I want to mention that this society was extremely spiritual, adhering to tribalistic traditions. Chico, an in-game folklore expert, who authored The Analysis of Jarilo, God of Spring and War, stated, "The god of death was seen as a ritualistic sacrifice and carries heavy symbolic meaning. Similar metaphors can be found in other mythologies. The bodies of dead gods creating the world, with blood turning into rivers, bones turning into mountains, hair turning into forests, and so on." While both the real world and in-game myths are again very similar, Honkai's version does expand a little beyond the Slavic legend. This endless cycle never seemed to end, the unfaithful Jarilo being murdered by autumn harvest, and Morana dying at the end of the year, only to be eventually reincarnated and fall in love again. That is, until one day the house she built was weak and collapsed. With no shelter from the frigid winter, Morana's rage overcame her, and she no longer accepted her fate of reconciling with Jarilo every year. As the goddess of nature and death, she placed a curse on herself. The next time she died, she wouldn't be reborn as Vesna, the goddess of youth and springtime. By the year's end, Morana did not die. The world was enveloped in perpetual winter that continued into the following year. It wasn't until Jarilo was reborn, Morana died, never to return. Realizing he could not face these cold nights alone, Jarilo sought his father, Perun, to seek repentance and forgiveness. Perun, having heard both stories, sympathized with Morana, but could not accept her curse. He told Jarilo should he once again be able to offer his eternal love and loyalty to Morana, only then would her anger be quelled. Jarilo fell into a deep depression as the cold storm continued to rage unto the autumn harvest. In the end, Jarilo offers to sacrifice his reincarnation, swearing everlasting and deep loyalty to his deceased lover. Jarilo's remorse and longing turned into a warm and forgiving spring that covered the land and protected the people, enabling them to live happily and peacefully in the snow-torn world. I think Chico can explain this last bit way better than I can. So, in his words, with the emergence of the Eternal Freeze, the world of the gods gradually began to weaken, until eventually the house built from Jarilo's corpse could no longer support human life and collapsed. It's clear the myth's ending was influenced by the Eternal Freeze. Before the Eternal Freeze, Jarilo was the typical birth, death, rebirth god of nature, whose mythological cycle was the same as that of crops in the northern regions of Nightcatha, from sowing to growing to harvesting. However, after the Eternal Freeze, the seasonal cycle was broken, replaced by Belobog's unique climate. All that remains is a barren wasteland of ice and fragments of the past. But how did we get there? We all know the Stellaron was responsible for the Eternal Freeze, but what events led up to Cocolia activating the Stellaron? Beyond the myth, what was the world like? One of the earliest historical references to the god Jarilo is in the biography of a diplomat from the Saya Kingdom, about 1800 years before the Eternal Freeze. On his expedition, he came across a tribe who happened to be celebrating the god of war, Jarilo-VI. Experts from before the Eternal Freeze believed Jarilo-VI was the precursor to Jarilo. Unfortunately, we don't really have any more information about the Saya Kingdom, though we can glean that the Saya Kingdom was advanced enough to have a written form of communication. Around 1200 years ago, in the northern region of Nightcatha, a festival known as Jarilo was celebrated in late spring or early summer. Groups of villagers would walk along the countryside, symbolizing the return of the god back into this world. His return meant fertility and vegetation. Experts from before the Eternal Freeze found traces of religious rituals in honor of this god. Some undisclosed time later, a war between the 11 Perun states and the Velis army scorched the land until an early spring completely changed the fortunes of war, and the Velis army had a total victory. They praised the spring god of war, Jarilo, for helping them eliminate their arch-enemy, and praised the land with poems of the same name. The current name of the planet in the galaxy's records, Jarilo-VI, may be a mistranslation that contains a poetry stanza number. When this mythological war was over, Jarilo-VI welcomed a long period of peace and developed from a society utilizing primitive oil lamps to one conducting space explorations. How did this society transition to a spacefaring nation so fast? Around 1,000 years before the Eternal Freeze, or even earlier, intergalactic civilizations like the Architects, the most important faction, Trade Commissioners of the Interastral Peace Corporation, and the Intelligentsia Guild, members who seek the flow of knowledge, began appearing at Jarilo-VI to initiate contact with the natives of the planet. The technological boom that was to come was most likely staggering, akin to an industrial revolution. Likely, much of the technology created was lost because of the Eternal Freeze. However, what remains can be found in and around Belobog. These can range from a simple radio to massive mechs like the Engine of Creation. Perhaps this drastic range in technology was a mixture of the natural progression of Jarilo's technological civilization mixed with the highly advanced gifts by spacefaring factions and corporations. Anyway, this period of peace and prosperity did not last. The intensive development that brought massive technological advances to Jarilo would also end up being their demise. 30 years before the Eternal Freeze, the history of Jarilo would change forever. Already exhausted of their planet's few resources, another tragedy struck as a Stellaron, the cancer of all worlds, appeared. People viewed the Stellaron as an ill omen, a sign of calamity, as wherever a Stellaron would appear, the Antimatter Legion would follow. Those who fled the planet fled out of fear. Those who remained rallied under the leadership of the eminent architect, Alyssa Rand. Architects all over the world began building shelters. Alyssa Rand, in this period, would start construction on Belobog, the city of preservation. It was also around this time Richard Balakin and other architects would construct the kaiju-sized robot we fondly know as the Engine of Creation. The purpose of this machine was geological transformation, which, yeah, makes sense. Also, around this time, Dr. Mearsheimer created his prototype personal bodyguard, Svarog. 20 years before the Eternal Freeze, it finally happened. Invaders from beyond the sky descended upon the surface of Jarilo-VI with a meteor shower. The Antimatter Legion officially invaded, and shelters on the planetary surface fell one after another. The battlefront was eventually pushed to the then incomplete city of Belobog, and the city announced its participation in the war. With Alyssa Rand leading its armies, the 30-year-long defense of Belobog began. In this period, Rhonda Landau becomes a significant figure during a decisive battle in the defense of Belobog. When Belobog was finally complete, Alyssa Rand, whether on purpose or on accident, utilized the Stellaron's powers to bring about the Eternal Freeze, destroying the Antimatter Legion. For Alyssa Rand's major efforts, she gained the moniker She Who Evokes Miracles, and became the first Supreme Guardian of Belobog. While the Eternal Freeze saved Belobog from certain destruction, it also doomed its descendants. For the next 700 years, the last bastion of humanity would have to persevere against the immutable winters and the ghosts of its past wrought by the Stellaron.